chat so that I can see if anyone wants to put anything in the chat. And so, yeah, I'm just going to give this little presentation. I have no notes. Normally, I have a script that I'm reading, and I don't for this talk. And I'm talking, so like this title is Designing for Equity. And I guess that's what I'm always doing in a kind of way, even though I actually do push back on words like equity and inclusion, and because I think that they actually continue to support the idea of sometimes they continue to support the idea of a dominant narrative, and we're going to include you in your conversation. And I said this in a conversation yesterday, I don't actually want to be included in the conversation that's already existed as it is. If we're talking about inclusion, we really also have to be talking about co-design and changing the conversation to suit the people who are in the room. So a little bit about me. I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, as Sheila said. I studied design first at UFPR, that's Universidade Federal do Paraná in Brazil. And that just kind of blew my mind open. Imagine a 19-year-old going to Brazil by themselves before the internet. And it completely changed my worldview. Even though that was like a really long time ago, I still collaborate with Brazilians on everything. We write together, we're on committees together. And so I guess it really affects my worldview. I worked at the University of the West Indies for, I never know if it was 10 years or 15 years. I'll say 15 years today, right? Where I worked both at the business school and in the creative arts department. Actually, I worked more in creative arts than the business school. Did my PhD in design at NC State, worked at Stanford for a year, spent 2 fantastic years at Tulane University, and now I'm back at NC State as a faculty member. And some words that guide the way that I practice: power, agency, access, emancipation. And then something else that guides the way that I think, this West African proverb, until the lion has his or her own storyteller, the hunter will always have the best part of the story. So I'm always trying to figure out, okay, what is the story that we're not hearing? How can I somehow support that story? Am I listening to that story, or am I just listening to the mainstream story? And then this other quote from the disability movement, and this artwork is by Ricardo Levins Morales, which says, "Nothing about us without us is for us." And I think that that's something that we have to really remember in the work that we do. Yeah, Yosef, that's an interesting point. In this story, in this sentence, the lion actually is the prey, right? And so like some of us will be the lions that our stories are not being told, right? It's a kind of strange perspective, but I think the important thing is that if we want to talk about colonizer and colonized, the hunter is the colonizer, and the hunter, then the colonizer always gets the best part of the story, or the dominant group always gets the best part of the story, right? And some other keywords that are guiding what I do: equity, co-creation, futures. This is where I'm trying to situate my practice. I am in equity, and I try to walk away from equity conversations that are kind of viewing the people who are disenfranchised as poor souls who need to be helped, and I'm really trying to focus on conversations about equity that are more emancipatory, more liberating, more, not seeing people as poor people who need some charity, right? All right. So how does this look in practice? I'm going to talk about, I think, 4 projects very quickly. And maybe people might have questions about them, right? So The first thing is the Positionality Wheel, which is available for download on my website. And then there's a template available on Mural. If you Google it, you'll see a link to Daniel Stillman's. Daniel Stillman made the template on Mural for the Positionality Wheel. But, you know, in qualitative research, people declare their positionality, and so that the person who's reading the research can understand the agendas of the people doing the research. And when I was doing my PhD, I chose qualitative methods. And again, this was another mind-blowing moment when I read the first time a positionality statement, and I was like, wow, we don't do this in design, or at least the design practice that I was coming from, we didn't do this, you know, and we were presenting our work as like very objective and blah, 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 you know, the facts told us this, when actually our agendas are always there. And so I learned to create this positionality statement in qualitative research. And then I was trying to figure out how to do this in design, and then made this wheel to get people to talk about their race, their age, gender, sexuality, to think about these things. Because sometimes when I use them, people think about them, and sometimes people talk about them, right? But, you know, just the act of getting you to slow down and think about it helps you to see, well, oh, maybe things aren't as objective as we think that they are, right? Actually, very recently, I found another version. I found a similar design of the same of my wheel. I found like another researcher who has a similar wheel. So I want to acknowledge her as well, and then say that we have never communicated with each other, seen each other's work. But in the feminist handbook, there's a similar kind of wheel that talks about intersectionality. And I think that that's maybe the idea here, that in design, we're bringing all of these identities into the work that we're doing. So we can't kind of say that we're doing work that is objective or impartial, because it's not, right? So that's just a whirlwind of the first project. The second project, which some of you might know, is the Designer's Critical Alphabet, which actually started, some of you might know the backstory, right? I was teaching in this class in California, and was very, very disturbed when I sent students off to do interviews. And I thought, and actually I was wrong in my assumption, but again, this is how our identities come into the work that we were doing. I thought that the students had all then interviewed variations of white men, you know, like 6 student groups. And for me, I looked at their interviews, the people who that they interviewed, and I was like, geez, these kids don't know anybody who is not white, not male, not, you know, and I was trying to think how to bring other people's point of view, how to force, I mean, literally force the students to think about our other perspectives. And so, you know, this class, I think it was on a Tuesday, I spent all of Wednesday making these little prototypes. And then on Thursday, came back to class again and said, well, okay, we're going to gamify this. There are these 3 cards on the table. You have to flip a card, and then you have to change the perspective of your design, right? And so the first 3 cards of the alphabet were about critical race theory or race, feminist theory or gender, and then age. This 3rd card never made it into the deck, where it was to force people to think of different ages as in products that they were designing, right? And actually the age card, surprisingly, was a little bit of a cop-out, where I didn't want people to see me as the person who kept pointing fingers and literally pulling the race card all the time, which I do. I talk about race all the time, right? But this was me trying to bring in a perspective that was a little bit less polemic, and that's how the age thing came in, right? And so eventually that turned into this entire deck of cards, because throughout the rest of the semester working with these students, I was thinking of what are other things or concepts that I had learned about in my PhD that I wanted people to think about in the work that they were doing, right? And then later on, a friend of mine created this app. So, you know, even though people use the cards, actually all the information is out there for free, right? Because there is an app and there is a website where people can still get the information as well, right? Later on, I made another version of, at the end of 2021, I made another version of this deck, which is really more, I think there are two things that ground this version of the deck, where one thing is, it's just called the Good Vibes deck. I haven't figured out a better name. The name might change eventually, but it really was that 2021 for me was like such a crappy year. Not just for me, for so many people. You know, we thought that the pandemic was over or was close to being over, and it wasn't. It just wouldn't go away. And here we are in 2022, and it still hasn't gone away. And so then this other deck was about things like care and healing and optimism and relationality and slowness and queering and thriving. And so it really was supposed to be a deck that was, one, grounded in more positive design principles. And I even will say, as I created it, I was thinking, I am a person from the global South, right? And I was thinking, okay, what does design look like if it is really led by non-European or non-American, non-Western in quotes, because I am from the West, right? But you know, what if it was guided by different design principles, you know? And so all of these words were pulled out of, or most of these words were pulled out of texts that I had been reading by decolonial theorists. And I thought that these are principles that maybe we bring to design when we bring our positionality from other places into the process. Then, all right, I'll check out Sheila's question just now. Finally, so, you know, if we go back to the earlier slides that I had created about access, and the earlier slide that talks about my principles. So I'm one of the editors of this book called The Black Experience in Design. And in the way that I've worked on, that I've contributed to this book, you can still see my design principles woven through this. So, you know, access, emancipation, oh my goodness, I don't remember the, the other principles that I had, right? But, you know, like so I worked on 3 chapters in this book. And one chapter is on design scholarship, one is on Afrofuturism, and one is on liberatory and radical spaces. And so each editor is like a curator and is telling their own story through the book. And so as I worked on these chapters, I really was thinking, okay, how do I get people to write? How do I get, so I worked with about 15 people, and I said, these 15 people have to tell me their stories, despite all of the barriers that exist in publishing, despite the fact that maybe people said that you aren't a good writer, a good designer, a good whatnot. So as I created this part of the book, I was thinking, okay, how do I create access for the people who I wanted to participate in the book, right? So I sent them prompts, we created writing workshops, they really did a lot of coaching to make sure that things happen. I did interviews with people and then transcribed the interviews to get that into the book. Then the other thing you'll see with my keywords and how they play out in the book is that I really try to see, how do we get the conversations to focus on the future, right? So there's the Afrofuturism chapter. And then, you know, how do we get the liberatory thread in? You know, I asked people to tell me about the spaces that they had created despite whatever barriers they were facing. So I really didn't want to get people to focus on writing about the barriers. I wanted people to write about what comes next, you know, and what have they done, because I think that that's also an emancipatory stance, you know, the fact that we will thrive even though people might not want Black designers around, or, you know, and it might even be like that specific that people don't want Black designers around, but people have created these barriers. But I wanted stories about thriving. So there are, and I'm going to stop for questions just now, right? So like here you could see the book. There are 595 pages in this book, 75, no, I think 70 contributors in the book. These are the authors that I worked with: Audrey Bennett, Nee Botchway, who I think everyone should read his essay. It's really short, but in this really short essay, he challenges both design and Blackness. You know, he says, why are you calling me Black, right? That's your term, that's not my term, right? And why are you, what is this thing that you're talking about, design, right? Cheryl Miller, Alicia Ajayi, David Pilgrim. Lonnie Brooks is a professor in California who has been using Afrofuturism in his work. Similarly, Woodrow Winchester, another professor. John Jennings is an illustrator who he illustrated Parable of the Sower. And let's see. Then this last chapter about liberatory and emancipatory spaces. Maurice Cherry, you have to read Maurice Cherry's story about how his podcast started, you know, the kind of rejection that he dealt with first, and the fact that he went through and he just did the work, right? And then Adrienne Marie Brown writes this, well, she didn't write it. We had a conversation, an amazing like 20-minute conversation. She was in a parking lot and we were chatting, right? But she talks about design and visionary spaces and futurism. And all right, so I think I'm gonna stop here and see if people have any questions, comments, if they want to just jump into the conversation. So I'm gonna stop my presentation and stop sharing. And yeah, open it up for questions. I know that there was a question in the chat. Let's see what Sheila's question was.
I can say it out loud.
Yes.
So the question was, how do we navigate creating a safe space to discuss race in design? And I want to keep this broad, but I do want to flag that sometimes you are the minority in the room. And you are
not also, sometimes, you're always a minority.
Right. And you're having hard conversations that you shouldn't be having, right? So I just want to hear your thoughts on how to navigate that.
So I guess I might even, I'm going to react to one thing you said. Why shouldn't we be having these conversations? When you said having conversations that we shouldn't be having.
That was referencing, sometimes we tend to be educators and we're constant educators and we don't have an opportunity to be a designer at that moment, which is why I framed it as creating a safe space to have those conversations.
Yeah. So I think, unfortunately, we will always be educating, right? I think that it's just going to be part of the role. And I know that there is work that people who are not the minority have to do so that the people who are the minority are able to relax a little bit more, right? You know, I'm trying to think how to respond. I think you just have to have these conversations, right? How do we navigate creating a safe space to discuss race and design? So those positionality conversations that I start every class and every project with are for us to start that conversation. And it is then starting with a tool or a method that people really do use in research. You know, so when people want to say, and this actually did happen to me when I was teaching, when I was co-teaching with some people, and they, you know, they actually did say, well, you talk about race all the time, right? Or something like that. And, you know, kind of would roll their eyes and say, oh my God, here we go again. But at least I was able to then say, well, actually, researchers in X field, you know, anthropologists or whoever, you know, people who talk about positionality in their work And there are many fields where people declare their positionality at the start, you know, and at least I was able to then clearly say, well, look, in these spaces, you do have to talk about who you are first. And we can talk about this, right? And so, I mean, you can know that people are going to reach, some people are going to take issue with having to talk about race, but in the work that we do as designers, I think you have to bring that conversation in. You have to maybe prep the conversation and say, well, okay, it is going to get a little bit uncomfortable, but we're here to, you know, you have to use all of that kind of fuzzy language. We're here to listen, we're here to, right? Because the thing is, it is uncomfortable, but depending on what you're designing, you can't get away from these conversations, right? So this is called Service Design Jam. You are, I'm assuming, designing services for, you know, some of you are going to be designing services for the public. And if you are designing services for the public, you have to be able to talk about race and gender and age and all, you know, so you're going to have these conversations as part of the work that you do, right? So, I mean, there's no easy answer. I've done a lot of DEI training, so I've learned along the way from other facilitators about what's to do. But I think that you just have to kind of commit and say that we are going to do this, right? And it will make people uncomfortable. And, you know, you can prep it though, I suppose, with some readings that you could share with other people. I'll say this, which I hope no one will be offended by this, but well, there's that you're going to say things that will offend people, but white men are normally the group that will be a little bit uncomfortable with conversations about race, right? And then I guess white women have different, sometimes there are different tensions with white women, right? So, you know, you could, if you're brave enough, acknowledge that before you start, right? Or you could start with something just a little bit more bland, say, it is going to be uncomfortable, but we have to talk about this, right? Let me see, what has Bianca said? Oh,
I think
sorry.
It's good for white men to experience some discomfort every now and again. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know?
We're all uncomfortable all the time, right?
Yeah.
We're the only group that is not uncomfortable, right? You know, and you know, like even groups within white men who probably should have more discomfort don't, you know, like I can't remember the details, but I do recall a conversation with maybe a gay white man who was saying, I don't feel the discomfort that you feel, right? And so, you know, if it's just the one space where they're uncomfortable, maybe they'll understand how the rest of us kind of feel all the time, right? Well, not all the time, but very often, right? Bianca has some
I was just making comments, don't worry. Definitely
okay.
attend to people who might have certain questions. I was just bringing up kind of different ways that, you know, throughout the design process, like asking those questions about, I think especially, you know, from who are we choosing to conduct our research with, all the way to, okay, does whatever concept we're going to prototype or launch actually address very different groups of people's needs? Because, you know, you always try to, of course, do the best that you can in providing some kind of experience for, you know, a broad audience or user groups. And so it's just, I think it's just a really avid practice of kind of bringing in those questions all the time throughout your designing anything, really.
Yeah, one thing I want to add to what you're saying, Bianca, is that, you know, like we have to also figure out as designers, how are we really going to get feedback from the people who are actually impacted, right? And so like I'm in academia, so I can try to create the class that I think is best practices. And so one semester when I was at Tulane, we had our stakeholders were in the class almost every week, you know, and they were the ones who were giving feedback on, like it was like they were the ones who were almost evaluating what the students had designed. And then another thing that the students had to do, which was very traumatic, I'll never do it again, but it was a really good experience, is that they had to share their designs in progress in Facebook groups and Reddit groups, right? And we did this because we had to figure out how we were getting public input and feedback, despite the fact that we were in the middle of a pandemic. And so I had this bright idea. Okay, well, y'all will join these Facebook groups and you'll share your stuff. And so one student, had an experience that was a little bit traumatic, but she said she grew tremendously after. But it was that, this person from the public gave really valuable feedback, but very raw, right? But even that became like a teaching moment, that actually the public doesn't have to give us, they don't have to sugarcoat the feedback that they're giving us, right? They just have to give us the feedback. And then we have to figure out how we're going to use that to grow, right? So, I mean, I've now taken it away from talking about race, but making sure that we're really figuring out this participatory or co-design, this element that has to happen that maybe doesn't always happen, right? Or, either we're managing how real people in quotes are talking with us and engaging with us in our work, and, and we have to figure out how are we going to actually make these spaces happen where we're going to get this feedback, this user input. How do you navigate conversations like this in spaces that you see potential for change in, but the leadership isn't ready to talk about this? Y'all are asking me these hard questions, right? And I'll say why y'all are asking me these hard questions is that, like I said a second or so ago, I'm in academia. So that ends up giving me a lot of safety and power, right? Because I can kind of say, well, I'm Dr. Noel and therefore blah, 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 right? And I think if you have that kind of privilege, you do use it, right? Where I've done this in consulting, it's not kind of navigating conversations. I'm going to share an anecdote that might be useful. Like I work as a consultant, and I've changed the terms of reference, so like they'll give me the terms of reference for something, say, well, are you willing to bid on this? And I'll take it and I'll literally kind of mark it up and say, no, I'm not going to bid on what you've sent me, but this is the project. This is the way I think the project should be done. And if this is it, then I will do the work. But I can do that because I'm operating from the safe space of where I am in academia, so you'll have to measure for yourself and see where can you actually take that kind of, where can you actually push a little bit harder. I think if you see spaces where there's potential for change, you have to call it out and you have to tell people, well, this thing that we're doing is not best practice, but if we do this thing this way, it will go better. Or, another strategy that you can do is you can see, well, okay, what are the things that you can do without asking for permission? And then you can, you can share those things back, where are the spaces that you can make small changes, again, without kind of, and then with those small changes, you can demonstrate to leadership, well, this actually works, right? I did have a situation where, I've been in various situations where leadership wasn't that interested, but people are happy with results. So like I could do things where, there are things that I did where I just kind of took like huge risks, right? When I was at Tulane, we did this podcast. I didn't ask anybody for permission. We just did this podcast. And it's when the podcast, because it was something we could do with no budget, right? When it started to get popular or successful, or, that's when the leadership was like, oh my goodness, this thing is fantastic. So, I mean, there may be ways that you can figure out how to do these small things that either you can share back to the leadership or share among colleagues who will validate you. And maybe that's the other thing that I should say. You can always figure out how can you get external validation for your ideas. part of why I'm able to operate fearlessly now is because I'm part of the Design Research Society, which is an international organization, and people within that international organization think that my work is worth something, right? And so anytime I'm in any, I think I've been in 4 universities since I've been in the Design Research Society. Anytime anyone within the university gives me any kind of pushback, I could kind of say, well, here's a publication that they approved, right? And so, I mean, there may be a way that you can find external validation for the work that you want to do that is cutting edge, whether it's even something as informal as a Medium post that starts to go viral or something like that. When your leadership sees that, you don't have to answer any questions anymore because the external audiences and networks are telling you that your work is fantastic. All righty, anything in the last 20 seconds?
Anyone just want to yell out their question?
Dr. Noel, if people want to connect with you on LinkedIn, is that possible?
Of course, connect with me, reach out, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, any one of those you can reach out and I will see your message. I will say hi if you want to say hi, stuff like that. And yeah, just connect. Tell me what's going on with you, right?
Okay. Thank you so much for everything, Dr. Noel. We have really, really enjoyed chatting with you, getting to know you a bit more, and also having very hard conversations. So thank you everybody else in the audience as well for creating this safe space for us to have this dialogue as designers.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone.
Dr. Noel, can we do a quick group picture?
Oh, yeah. What do you want me to do?
Anyone who's comfortable, put your camera on.